In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the world saw unprecedented progress towards greater freedom and what many believed at the time would be the inevitable global triumph of the institutions and ideas of liberal democracy. From the replacement of military juntas with freely elected governments throughout Latin America, to the people-powered overthrow of dictators like Marcos in the Philippines, to the Chinese students protesting in Tiananmen Square, to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the ultimate collapse of the entire Soviet Union, freedom certainly was on the march. But the first 2 decades of the 21st century have seen quite a different trend, with nations large and small, north, south, east, and west, increasingly governed by authoritarian leaders and regimes, sometimes duly elected, raising questions about the future of the rule of law and the protection of individual human rights around the world. This episode of The Whole Truth was made possible by Amatec, CNX, UGI Amerigas, SEI, Buchanan Ingersoll Rooney, and by
For hundreds of years in English-speaking courtrooms around the world, people have sworn an oath to tell not only the truth, but rather the whole truth. The oath reflects the wisdom that failing to tell all of a story can be as effective as lying if your goal is to make facts support your point of view. In the courtroom, the search for truth also relies on advocates advancing firm, contradictory arguments and doing so with decorum. All of these apply to the court of public opinion, what John Stuart Mill called the marketplace of ideas. This series is a place in which the competing voices on the most important issues of our time are challenged and set into meaningful context so that viewers like you can decide for themselves the whole truth. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, many in the United States and Europe were positively giddy about what they saw as an unstoppable trend towards democracy around the world. From the dispatch of Pinochet from Chile, the last military dictator in Latin America in that generation, to Chinese students parading a replica of the Statue of Liberty past the giant portrait of Chairman Mao in Tiananmen Square, to the end of apartheid in South Africa, with the benevolent calls for reconciliation by Nelson Mandela, to the scenes of sledgehammers breaking down the Berlin Wall, to the unforgettable moment when the flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the mast above the Kremlin for the last time. It was hard not to be giddy. But so far, the 21st century has seemed a sharp rebuke to those end-of-history hopes. More and more nations are being governed by authoritarians and autocrats, some using language of the left, some of the right, some from the military, some oligarchs rising from new forms of state-controlled capitalism. The empire strikes back. A new age of strongman rulers seems upon us. Yet no new ideology comparable to communism has risen to challenge the basic broad principles of Western liberal democracy. Elections are more and more the means by which rulers attain power. But elections are more and more resulting in empowering rulers with little regard to the rule of law and the political and civil rights of those who might wish to dissent. If democracy means popular sovereignty, if it means a government is legitimate, if it has the political support of a majority of its citizens, then many of the increasingly authoritarian governments are democracies, including, for example, Russia, where, while elections are not free by Western standards, legitimate polls show overwhelming popular support for Putin. If, on the other hand, democracy means limits on government in order to protect the rights of individuals, particularly rights for political disagreement, then democracy may well be more threatened around the world today than it was even in the heyday of communism. Here today to discuss these important questions on this episode of The Whole Truth are Dr. George Soroka, Assistant Director of Undergraduate Studies at Harvard University, Sarah Repucci, Senior Director for Global Publications at Freedom House, Dr. Ely Ratnor, Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Thor Halvorson, President of the Human Rights Foundation. Welcome, everyone. Commentators today are decrying what they see as the 21st century backlash against the movement towards democracy and greater political freedom in the post-Cold War years at the end of the 20th century. Are we in fact living in a new age of authoritarianism? Now, as I present that question, I'm also curious how people would define authoritarianism. I know that there are lots of governments out there that we approve of or disapprove. Authoritarianism, does it have a precise meaning or multiple meanings or whatever? How would you approach that? But first, Dr. Soroka.
I think there's no arguing that we've certainly seen democracy come under stress in recent years. In the region of the world that I primarily study, which is Russia and Eastern Europe, I would say we have to qualify a little bit what exactly we're speaking about. Most of the people we think about as strongmen or rising strongmen in that region have actually been democratically elected. So I just want to put a caveat in there. I don't think it's a crisis of democracy per se that we're talking about, at least in that region. It's a crisis of liberal democracy, and we often forget that adjective. These figures that we in the West consider to be authoritarian or have authoritarian tendencies are, for the most part, genuinely popular at home. And for the most part, they have been elected in more or less free elections. Now, these may not have been fair elections. The playing field may have been tilted. Governments in power already trying to stay in power may have used what the Russians euphemistically call administrative resources to co-opt media to give them preferential coverage, to co-opt state resources to give them an advantage. But the fact of the matter is that most of these people, Andrzej Duda in Poland, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Vladimir Putin in Russia, genuinely enjoy the support of their people. So for me, the question is not so much the rise of the strongman, it's the rise of populist politics and this narrative that allows such figures to be elected in these countries.
Sure. Well, from the perspective of Asia and China in particular, I think for sure we've seen a backsliding of democracy or at least tendencies toward political liberalism there. We've long thought that the integration of China into the international system as well as their economic development would lead to a series of harmonious cycles, including not only the strengthening and opening of their economy, but also the widening of social space within China. And we actually did see that throughout the 1980s and 1990s and into the 2000s. But what we've seen over the last decade, and particularly over the last 5 years under Xi Jinping, has been a rollback of their reform and a tightening of society across the board, whether it relates to censorship, the role of dissidents, religious leaders.
I saw staggering numbers on this, by the way, and I'm wondering if you could confirm them, of the number of arrests under the Chinese anti-corruption drive and the number of convictions. Have you seen those numbers?
There have been staggering numbers as well at lower levels, as well as some quite senior officials who have been caught up in that, though. To be fair, there was substantial corruption problems within China, so some of that is a political witch hunt, but a lot of it is cleaning up what they saw as a very corrupt communist party.
We're not talking about hundreds, we're talking about tens of thousands.
That's right.
Yeah, no, this is quite substantial. Thor?
I think it's important when discussing the issue of the rollback of democracy. George pointed out that we were really talking about liberal democracy, because just having elections doesn't really go to the heart of it. Steve Levitsky of Harvard University, I think, has come up with the best description of what authoritarianism is, and it encompasses two styles of government. Fully authoritarian, so you have fully fledged dictatorships like the one in Cuba or North Korea or China, which under no circumstances can be called anything but a fully fledged dictatorship. And then you have competitive authoritarian states, places that have elections, but by and large, fundamental rights and freedoms do not exist. And that, of course, was Russia began as a competitive authoritarian state under Putin and then became a fully fledged dictatorship. Now, if a system is built well enough and there are checks and balances, there's a vigorous civil society, and there can be protection of the freedom of expression and freedom of the press, then any state can actually elect someone who's either narcissistic or a populist and still survive the populist, because you have a system that allows them to go into office and out of office. The problem becomes when people go into office, like we're seeing potentially in Hungary and Poland, and like we've already seen in Turkey and Russia, and then once they're in office, they begin dismantling it. And then people come back and say, but they're popular. If they're popular, they don't need to put people in prison, shut down media. If they're popular, they don't need to meet protests with violence. So this is how one knows when someone has gone fully fledged. So this is the rollback of the last 12 years, I think, is in great part the fault of liberal democracies. Liberal democracies who have actually not seen it coming. If one looks at the worst influence in Latin America in the last 18 years with regard to democracies, it was Hugo Chavez, who spent $100 billion in gifts, whether it was building someone an airport in Caribbean islands, and the answer was, I'm going to support you, I'm going to give you money, but you will vote for me at the UN and at the OAS, and you will give me photo-op cordiality. And this is how he ended up moving Bolivia into a competitive authoritarian state, Ecuador, which miraculously did not become fully fledged, Nicaragua. All of these elections were done with Venezuelan money. What we are seeing is truly a struggle between liberal democracies and authoritarians. And if the West does not wake up to this, whether it's civil societies in the West or governments in the West, they will continue expanding.
Interesting categories. Now, how does Freedom House distinguish between free, partly free, and not free?
So we look at a range of political rights and civil liberties, things like the conduct of the elections, the party structure, the functioning of the government, but also the basic fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. And we look at each country and we compare them. And what we've noticed is that that increasingly, as my colleagues have said, democratically elected leaders go after certain freedoms, especially the rule of law and freedom of speech. What
are foreign policy consequences? America is looking at this world that we're in. George Herbert Walker Bush, 1989, his inaugural. We live in a peaceful, prosperous time. The day of the dictator is over. The totalitarian era is passing.
Great nations of the world are moving toward democracy through the door to freedom. Men and women of the world move toward free markets through the door to prosperity. The people of the world agitate for free expression and free thought through the door to the moral and intellectual satisfactions that only liberty allows. We know what works. Freedom works. We know what's right. Freedom is right. We know how to secure a more just and prosperous life for man on earth.
This is 30 years ago.
Right.
This is America's unipolar moment. Now we're encountering a lot of resistance here and there and so forth. What are the foreign policy consequences for us?
Many of the people we are talking about, at least in the European context, as strongmen or potential strongmen, reverting to something that looks not like a Western liberal democracy, are actually claiming to be doing it through democratic means, right? So the interesting thing is, during the 20th century, we've had this great battle between three main political ideologies. You had fascism, totally discredited after World War II. You had communism, completely discredited even before 1989, but certainly by the Polish Roundtable talks, and then Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Democracy is all that's left. But these people in power are using the language of democracy to essentially bolster their political projects.
But these are all leadership cults, aren't they? Strongmen? Do we see a totalitarian phenomenon on the horizon anywhere?
I think a big difference that we see at Freedom House versus, say, the totalitarianism of 40 years ago is that the mode of control nowadays is to allow some pluralism, but to keep it under control. And it's not totalitarian. It's, you have some civil society. It can be quite vibrant. It just can't touch certain issues. You have a vibrant media. It's very entertaining. It covers a lot of different issues. It just doesn't criticize the government. And keeping those forms of civil society active is part of the way that these leaders keep their control, because the populations feel like they can vote in elections. There's even an opposition. Mm-hmm. That opposition is totally pliant, but a lot of people might not know, because their media doesn't inform them, that these people are in the pocket of their leader. And and because they don't have any civil society doing investigations, ordinary people aren't aware of what's happening.
Mm-hmm. What kind of staying power do these regimes have? We know democracies become corrupted, and democracies can deteriorate and disappear. We know that totalitarian regimes can fall. What kind of staying power does this wave of populism strike you as having, number one? And number two, what can the United States do?
In terms of what this portends for the future, you know, I wanted to push back a little bit before about Thor's point. It's not only about having the right institutions in place. It's the fact that these institutions were so easily overwritten. They had good institutions into place, but the informal institutions, not what's codified on paper, not what's codified in the Constitution,
right,
haven't adopted a liberal mindset.
Yeah, the ethic.
The ethic, exactly right. That you know, we can look at the United States. We didn't codify how many terms a president could have until after FDR, but it was an unwritten rule. The same kind of political culture doesn't yet exist in these states. Right. So for Poland and Hungary and the new EU member states, you know, I think for the time being, for at least several election cycles, the current parties in power will continue. In part, they'll continue because they're making a lot of hay about the culture war. And make no mistake about it, it is a culture war that's going on. These are more traditional societies, these are more religious societies, and they're saying, hey, you're pushing gay rights, you're pushing this feminist agenda, this doesn't resonate with us.
Happening everywhere.
Exactly right, but it's felt even more profoundly in those countries. But in those states, you know, this belt of dissent that kind of goes along the eastern edge of Europe, there are mechanisms that both the United States and even more specifically the European Union can impose. And right now, this is a conversation that's going on. So there are real institutional mechanisms that, if the will exists, can be put into place.
Do you expect to see more or fewer partly free or unfree nations on the Freedom House list in years to come? Will these dictatorships have staying power? What are we going to do in the meanwhile?
I mean, sadly, I don't think we're at the end of our declining trend. You know, it would take a movement that we haven't yet seen beginning and to turn it around. But I do think the United States does have a huge role to play in this in terms of its foreign policy. When the U.S. leads in support of democracy, it's extremely powerful, and it brings a lot of other countries together with it. And the United States, when it serves as a positive model, it's inspiring to people all over the world. And I think we have seen, under the Obama administration, a withdrawal of U.S. leadership on democracy, and that has intensified under the Trump administration.
I was going to say something that makes the Chinese example unsettling is that they appear to have decoupled prosperity and democratic freedom. In the Bush message in 1989, I think that there's a clear connection. In fact, it flows seamlessly, walking through doors of prosperity, new breeze of blowing. The era of dictator is over. The Chinese seem to have come up with a model which combines economic prosperity and authoritarian rule. Would you consider that to be artificial? Would you consider that to be does that amount to an ideological challenge that America is going to have to address, or is this, or is China in some way?
Well, I think they've managed
vulnerable because of this.
Well, I think they've managed to pull that off for a number of decades, though their economic growth has clearly slowed, and they have a number of mounting crises on top of some of their economic fundamental problems associated with debt and their messy financial system. And otherwise, they have demographic problems, environmental problems, obviously political and social problems as well. I think their day will come in terms of them unable to do this tightening and decreasing of rights at home and opening up of economics and growth. But that hasn't happened yet. People have been predicting that they wouldn't be able to sustain this long, and they've outlived expectations. I think we should expect that they won't be able to do it forever, but they can do a lot of damage in the meantime. I think to answer your question as to what do we do about it, I would agree with Sarah that I think we need to be our best selves, and that's where we need to start. My old boss, Joe Biden, used to say we need to lead by the power of our example and not the example of our power, and I think that's true, not because issues we're having today at home are somehow comparable to issues elsewhere, but because it is important that American democracy is seen as a second. But let me just add, I think the one thing that we haven't talked about, just referenced a little bit, is the role of information and technology in this space. And I think that's an area where the United States is just starting to learn how to play defense a little bit against authoritarians, but we need to start learning how to play offense too. And that's something that we haven't done at all in the information space.
We did so well in the Cold War.
Exactly.
And
those institutions and that muscle memory inside the government, we shut down the U.S. Information Agency, and that has atrophied as part of our government, and we need to rebuild those and get back out, both telling our message and also doing a better job of penetrating both the fence sitters as well as the authoritarian regimes with technologies and information.
Thor, how do things look from the perspective of the Human Rights Foundation?
I think that, well, first off, I want to go back to the authoritarian versus totalitarian.
Yeah.
There are totalitarian countries still in the world. Although most of them have moved toward authoritarianism, you still have, for instance, Eritrea, Equatorial Guinea, places people never even hear about because journalists aren't allowed into Equatorial Guinea, for instance. Cuba, North Korea, these are totalitarian police states. Now, they're less, but authoritarianism is actually growing. The way to resolve this is to understand two things. One, that populations that are under authoritarianism their critical thinking tends to atrophy, which is why Mubarak stayed in power for decades. And what he did with the West was say, it's me or the Muslim Brotherhood. So instead of these authoritarians being able to destroy the opposition, they would keep it on a leash in the basement. And every time the West would say, we'd like you to liberalize, they would bring it back up and say, me or them, choose. Eventually, they're going to get deposed, like Mubarak. And now you have a population that for 30 years, universities, professors, all these things, people left, and what you have locally are people that are very, very open to populism, which is why the Muslim Brotherhood went immediately into government in what was unquestionably an open election, but with all sorts of problems because you have a population that doesn't really have an understanding of fundamental human rights and why they're necessary. The way to address the authoritarianism is, I think it's great that the United States government take a role, but I'm not expecting them to be the answer to this. The answer to this is not Western governments. Western governments have failed dismally at this. They failed in opportunity and another opportunity, whether it was 1989, 1996, where you pointed out they destroyed the institutions that were actually doing a great job. Once the Cold War was over, people said, oh, no, now we have to focus on the drug war, not the Cold War. Civil society is what we need to do, people helping people. And it needs to be, ballet dancers helping ballet dancers, engineers helping engineers, veterans in the U.S. with veterans in Russia and in other countries, and really try and make that happen. What government should be doing should be focusing on why authoritarianism exists. Authoritarianism exists because they desire loot. It's about money. It's about gold. It's not about ideology. Ideology is merely the excuse they give in order to push forward an idea. The Chinese Communist Party is not communist. Most of them are multi-billionaires, and they're in it for themselves and for their families. What Western countries should do is seize their wealth. Take it. Take Putin's wealth. Take the wealth of his enablers. Take the wealth of all of those people. In the case of Venezuela, $1 trillion disappeared. And where did it go? Miami, New York, apartments, the stock market. Right. What Western countries should do is seize the wealth because that's what they're after. Authoritarianism is about loot, plain and simple.
I think that's very eloquent, actually. It's about loot, which would give us at least some encouragement to think that perhaps this is a phase, that this is a period that we're enduring right now, and that it's not sustainable. This has been a very important discussion, could not be more timely, and we truly appreciate your insights. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you all. In the United States, we commonly use the terms freedom and democracy as virtual synonyms. It's not surprising, however imperfect in practice, that our democracy is a set of institutions most fundamentally aimed at the protection of individual freedom. As we look around the world today, a rising percentage of humanity is ruled by authoritarian governments, including the vastly powerful nations of China and Russia. Almost nothing of what Americans understand to be the rule of law and protection of individual rights exists in these nations. At the same time, the ruling elites appear to have a solid grasp on the consent of the governed, with large majorities of the people, including young people, supporting these regimes. Perhaps we see a world in which, in some sense at least, Rule with the will of the people is actually in opposition to the protection of human freedom. The whole truth of the rise of authoritarianism in these early years of the 21st century is that whenever anyone proclaims the end of history, the end of humanity's battle with itself between our better and worse angels, that proclamation will doubtlessly be proven false. The defenders of freedom surely won a great victory with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the era of communism as a moral and intellectual global force and movement. But the need to defend freedom from its new opponents has just begun. I'm David Eisenhower, and I thank you once again for watching The Whole Truth.
This episode of The Whole Truth was made possible by Amatec, CNX, UGI Amerigas, SEI, Buchanan Ingersoll Rooney, and by